Linda Thomas was born in 1951 in Port Talbot, Wales. 1951 was a year of careful, quiet rebuilding in Britain. The Second World War had ended 6 years earlier, but its weight had not lifted. Rationing was still in force across the country. Food, clothing and fuel had all been controlled and rationed since the war years, and for ordinary working families it remained a daily fact of life. The National Health Service had been created just 3 years before, in 1948, giving working people access to medical care for the first time without payment at the point of need. For communities in South Wales where generations of men had gone to the pits and come home with broken bodies and damaged lungs, that change meant something real and immediate. In 1951, Britain still produced around a quarter of all manufactured goods in the world. Its factories were running hard, its people were working. But beneath the industry and the output, there was a weariness. A country that had given everything it had to a war and was now slowly, quietly trying to rebuild. In Wales, that rebuilding had a particular character. The coal industry that had defined South Wales for a century still employed hundreds of thousands of men. The pits had been nationalised in 1947, brought under public ownership, and there was cautious hope that the men who worked them would now be properly supported and fairly paid. The valleys behind the coast ran deep with that history. Communities built around the industry, shaped by it, dependent on it in ways that went far beyond wages. Welsh identity in those communities was bound up with the coal and the steel and the chapel and the close-knit neighbourhoods that had grown up around all of it. Port Talbot itself sat on the southern coast of Wales, facing the Bristol Channel, with those same valleys rising behind it. It was a town almost entirely defined by steel. The steelworks that dominated its skyline were among the largest in Europe. Vast, industrial, relentless, producing steel that went into buildings, ships, and infrastructure across Britain and beyond. Generation after generation of Port Talbot families had worked there, and the rhythms of shift work had shaped daily life in the town for as long as anyone could remember. Port Talbot was a working town, straightforward about what it was, and everyone who lived there understood that. It was into this community that Linda Thomas was born and raised. She grew up on Harlequin Road. She was warm and direct. She knew her own mind. She had a specific dream for her future. She wanted to win big on the football pools one day, buy a large house on a hill above her native Port Talbot, and fill it with cats and dogs. It was a simple, particular, generous dream. The kind that tells you precisely what kind of person holds it. By the time Linda was in her early 20s, she had made a practical and independent decision about how she would earn her living. She became a taxi driver. In Port Talbot in the early 1970s, this was genuinely unusual for a young woman. Taxi driving was understood, by most people in the community, to be a man's job. The hours were long, the passengers were strangers, the work required driving alone with people you did not know at all hours of the day and night. Linda chose it regardless. She was, in the most practical and unassuming sense of the phrase, a young woman who did not wait for permission to do what she had decided she was going to do. She was 22 years old in the summer of 1973. She drove her taxi through Port Talbot. She earned her living. She went home to Harlequin Road. Trevor Thomas Henry Howell had also grown up in Port Talbot. He was born in 1945, 6 years before Linda, in the same town. Those who remembered him from his younger years described him as a bright boy who had worked hard on his grandparents' farm on the edge of town. Whatever that early promise had once suggested, his adult life had gone in an entirely different direction. By his 20s, Howell had become what people who encountered him described as a roamer, a man who drifted from town to town, moving on from one temporary job to the next, working occasionally as a cook, settling nowhere and building nothing. He had also accumulated a criminal record. He was a child sex offender. He had a violent streak. He had a string of convictions behind him. By the summer of 1973, he was 28 years old and he had no fixed address. 1973 in Britain was a year of serious pressure. The miners had gone on strike the previous year in a dispute over pay, the first national strike since 1926, and the political tension between the miners' union and the government had not been resolved. By the middle of 1973, conflict was building again. The global oil crisis, triggered by the Arab oil embargo in October of that year, would send fuel prices soaring and force the country toward crisis. By the end of 1973, the government would impose a 3-day working week to conserve electricity as coal stocks fell dangerously low, a measure that brought the country to the edge of breakdown and eventually brought down the government itself. For ordinary working people in South Wales, people who drove taxis and worked in steelworks and raised families in terrace streets, the politics of all of this sat at the edge of everyday life, felt in rising prices and shortened hours, without necessarily being named or fully understood. On the afternoon of Thursday, the 20th of June, 1973, Linda Thomas was working her shift. She was driving her taxi through Port Talbot when she was flagged down by a passenger. The passenger was Trevor Howell. He wanted to be taken into the Valley Road north of town. It was a short fare, the kind of job that filled an afternoon shift without any cause for concern. Linda drove north out of Port Talbot with Howell in the back of the cab. She did not return home that afternoon. She did not return that evening. She did not come home at all. When Linda failed to return, her family raised the alarm. Police were notified. A search for the missing taxi driver began. South Wales Police launched an active effort to find Linda and to establish what had happened to her. Officers worked through the area, speaking to witnesses, making appeals, trying to trace the movements of the taxi and its driver after she had last been seen. In the course of that search, 2 women came forward with something that would prove critical. They had been walking along a road in a small coastal village just outside Port Talbot on the afternoon of the 20th of June, when a taxi had passed them. What they saw inside the taxi had stayed with them. It had not made sense to them at the time, but it had stayed. They had seen a woman in the passenger seat of the moving taxi. The woman appeared completely expressionless. Her eyes did not move. She seemed not to be registering anything around her. The women had not understood what they were looking at. They reported it to police, and police understood immediately. The taxi had been driven through the village on the afternoon Linda disappeared, and the woman in the passenger seat, unmoving and expressionless, had been Linda Thomas. What the prosecution would later establish at trial was that Howell had attacked Linda Thomas inside the taxi and beaten her to death during the fare. After killing her, he had not abandoned the vehicle. He had propped Linda's body upright in the passenger seat and driven the taxi himself. back down toward the coast and into the small coastal village just outside Port Talbot, where the two women had seen him pass. He had then driven to a mine on the edge of that village and dumped Linda's body down a mine shaft at the entrance to a mine air-shaft. He left her there and walked away. The search continued for 9 days. On the 29th of June, 1973, 9 days after Linda had last been seen alive, her body was found at the entrance to the mine air-shaft. She had been there since the afternoon of the 20th of June. She had lain there through all 9 days of the search for her. Trevor Thomas Henry Howell was identified as a suspect, arrested, and charged with the murder of Linda Thomas. He was described in contemporary newspaper reports as a cook of no fixed abode, aged 28. He was remanded in custody and appeared before magistrates on multiple occasions as the case was prepared for trial. The Port Talbot Guardian and the Times of London both reported on the case as it developed. The trial of Trevor Thomas Henry Howell took place at Swansea Crown Court in October 1973. The prosecution presented its case in full. The two women who had seen the taxi being driven with Linda in the passenger seat gave their evidence. They told the court she had appeared expressionless, that her eyes had not moved, that she had given no indication of awareness of what was around her. The prosecution described how Henry had beaten Linda to death inside the cab and then driven her body to the mine. The Times of London, which reported on the trial on the 30th of October 1973, recorded the prosecution's description of the scene. The girl's body had been propped up in the cab. Trevor Thomas Henry Howell was convicted of the murder of Linda Thomas. He was sentenced to life imprisonment. The case was closed. Henry was taken to serve his sentence in the prison system of England and Wales. He served that sentence for the remainder of his life. He died of natural causes at Her Majesty's Prison, Norwich, on the 13th of August, 2017. He was 71 years old. He had killed Linda Thomas 44 years earlier. The case of Linda Thomas was featured in the CBS reality television series Murder by the Sea, broadcast in January 2021 under the title The Last Taxi Rider. The episode brought renewed public attention to Linda's story, to the town she had grown up in, and to the community that had been shocked by what had happened to her in the summer of 1973. The murder had made headlines across South Wales and beyond at the time. It had never been forgotten in Port Talbot. Hello everyone, thank you for listening and drop any feedback below. I would love to hear your thoughts and hope to see you again right here on Cold Case UK.